I fell in love with Margot the first time I tried to kill her. I placed a gun to the crease in her forehead and pulled the trigger. "Did it work?" Margot asked me. Clearly, her response told me that it did not. I opened my eyes and found the bullet had flattened against her skull. Margot had a condition, one that I don't think any medical book known to man can possibly explain. She was immortal. Of course, before that moment, I doubted her. For 3 months, she had insisted that she could not die. And for 3 months, I was sure I was talking to a crazy woman. Noose? Tried that. Knife? All the time. Pills? Absolutely. Nothing worked. When Margot reached out to me, I was admittedly baffled by the matter. I don't want to tell you what my trade is, but people don't seek me out because I sell kittens. Margot had found me in the deep recesses of the dark web, and her message was desperate. "I'm seeking a way to end my life. I have tried to do this alone, but it seems impossible to do so. I am willing to pay the person responsible for my death a sum of $100,000 that can be changed into any currency they wish. Please contact me at margot53@gmail.com. My first instinct was to assume that this was some kind of sting operation, an attempt to lure me or one of my colleagues out so that we could be caught in the act and thrown in jail. But for that amount of money, it was too easy to say yes, especially whenever Margot made certain that my identity would be protected. She provided me documents and money before even meeting me, all of which was legal tender. I had the opportunity to leave, but this entire matter intrigued me to no end. She had money apparently from the long life she had endured, and she wired it to an account I had set up in the Caymans. Even after that first attempt, she insisted I should take it and run. She didn't expect me to stick around and figure out her problems. Margot fascinated me though. The moment that bullet fell to the floor, I found myself asking 100 questions. How long had she been like this? Her whole life. How long was that? Margot claimed she had stopped counting after year 703. Then I came to the question that probably mattered the most. Why did she want to die? When you've lived as long as I have, seen the things that I have seen, witnessed the deaths of thousands, kingdoms and nations rise and fall, everything, and I mean everything, becomes meaningless. You're powerless. You lose everything that means being human. Death is the only thing you have any control over anymore. And with that gone, what can you accomplish in life? She told me about how she had seen children die more times than I could count, about events in history that no person living could ever get correctly. I discovered as we connected that I was developing a liking for this woman. She was the one thing in the world that was an anomaly, a window into the soul of humanity. So I made her a promise. I would help her die. We started small. I bought a few firecrackers and had her try to set them off directly in her face. She wasn't even mildly burnt. Then we moved to the tub. I had her undress and start the water. Then I brought in the toaster. I made certain the water was almost completely covering her body before dropping it in. She came out of the tub a few minutes later. This went on for almost the next 5 weeks. Each day, a different test. Car accident? Nothing. Jumping from a building? Nothing. Stabbing her in the face, the eyes. Again, it all seemed pointless. At one point, I got her to drink poison and she acted a little sick. But then the next day, she admitted she was faking. "I'm sorry. It's just, I felt like you were going to give up soon," Margot answered whenever I asked her why she pretended. "I won't. I can't. This defies everything you can ever believe in. It's beyond understanding," I told her. After that, we developed a closer bond as we started looking into more extreme methods. I managed to have her see one of my friends that works as an open-heart surgeon in a shady clinic for abortions. I recommended trying to put her in a coma and then taking out vital organs. The propofol did the trick to knock her out, but any instrument to cut her only bended and broke. I suggested placing an explosion in a tube down her throat. The surgeons got to work on preparing the device and then sliding it straight down her esophagus and into her stomach. I lit the fuse and waited. Her body jumped and rumbled a bit, but nothing more. Margot was a goddess. Every extreme we tried only resulted in more failures. Finally, she admitted that she decided to accept her fate. "If I have to keep on living, then so be it. At least I will be happy knowing that I have tried all possibilities," she said as we got back home. "I've wasted more of your time than ever necessary," she added as she passed me a briefcase with well over $2 million in it. "This is everything I have. I want you to take it. You've been so kind, so patient," she told me. I tossed it aside and made love to her that night. In the morning, I told her I wasn't planning on leaving her, that in the months we had spent together, I grew to love her more than life itself, more than death could ever separate us. So we married. We had a child. I forgot my old life. I made her smile again. So did our son. Out of all the times I have been with anyone, you have been my favorite, she told me. But still, I could tell behind all of this, her desire hadn't faded. She was still curious. Sometimes when I came home, I found dozens of pill bottles scattered across the floor. Other times she had ruined knives and caused house fires, desperate to end her life. She wasn't happy. I could see that now. She knew that no matter what, one day we would be gone, and she would still remain. On our 1-year anniversary, I surprised her and took her paragliding. I told her it might be the solution she was looking for. I made certain that she didn't have the equipment necessary to prevent her from experiencing the full brunt of the impact. I love you, she told me as our plane reached the proper altitude. I promised her I would never tell our son and said my goodbyes, then watched as she plummeted to the ground below. Once she was out of my line of vision, I told the pilot to touch down, and I ran to where she had hit the pavement. She was standing there waiting for me with tears in her eyes. "This is torture. I can't do this. I can't. Why? Why is this happening?" she screamed. I held her close and looked up at the heavens. Did God even have an answer for this? I thought there was nothing else that could be done, and I was certain that her depression would soon swallow me and our son whole. I begged her to forget this dark dream. "So what if we die? At least you have us now," I shouted one day. "You don't know how many times I've heard that before," she moaned angrily. That was when I knew there was nothing I could say that would stop her from trying. I worried for our safety, my son and I. I knew that in her attempts to take her own life, she might hurt us, even if she didn't mean to. One time she came close to drowning him in the tub while trying to end herself. Another time it was a knife and he almost cut his finger off. Something had to be done. I reached out to my colleagues from the old days, when I was the one that was seeking to exploit suicidal cash cows. I told them everything and asked for advice. Some took it as a joke, but one man had a solution that I had never considered before. Take her out to sea and dump her with stone weights on her legs. She may not die, but she'll never bother you again. I showed Margot. She said it was worth a try. We got a babysitter and set out for the coast a few weeks after that. As we moved toward the open ocean and I got things ready, I asked her if she was sure this was what she wanted. "It's the only way, right?" she said as she hugged my neck. We said our goodbyes and I watched her sink into the darkness below. I thought that was the end of it, that Margot was gone forever. But then she came to my door again, sobbing like an infant. She was covered in wet seagrass and moss. A tangled mess of barnacles covered her skin. The current had swept her along and the ropes that had tied her down had eroded. Water had filled her lungs for days on end. By all accounts, she should have been dead. Margot felt everything though. "It's hopeless! This is punishment! I just know it!" she screamed. I comforted her as our son watched on in wide-eyed confusion. I told her that we would think of something. But years went by and nothing came of it. Our son grew up and learned of his mother's condition and the sadness that crept into our lives because of it. "Why does Mom not want us? Why can't she just be happy?" he asked. It wasn't something I could explain. Margot isolated herself from us, going on trips for days to find doctors or get high on drugs or even terrorists. Absolutely nothing seemed to work though. Then one day after dinner, she tried to choke on some food and our son jumped up and tried to help her cough it up. "Get away from me! Just get away!" she screamed as he performed the Heimlich maneuver. She slapped him across the face. I stared in shock as she sobbed and ran off to our bedroom. My son only stormed out, angry and confused. This had gone on too long. I knew that if it continued, her curse would destroy our lives altogether. So I consulted the dark web again and looked into the mystic arts, spells, and tomes that no man dared read. I found one that I felt would fit the bill, and I bought it during a Christmas sale. When I showed Margot, she seemed hesitant to even give it a try. But since it was the last resort, she eventually conceded. We placed the goat's blood around our bed in a circle like the ritual implied, then chanted the phrase 6 times. We walked around the bed counterclockwise. Then I took her hand and we both fell asleep. When I woke up the next day, I was staring at my wife and she at me. but our souls had transferred into each other's bodies. She was mortal, and I was immune. The spell had worked. She reached into her drawer and pulled out a gun, meekly passing it to me. "Do it. I'm ready," she said. I pressed it toward her skull, closed my eyes, and finished the job. As the life drained from my body, I caressed her forehead and watched her breathe her last. She said 2 words, "Thank you," and then she was gone. That was so long ago. When I watched my only body fall into a grave, when I explained to my son that now the curse was upon me. He will be on his deathbed, and I will only watch in horror as he slips away. Margot was right about this curse, and it's one I carry now, one that holds a further curse upon me. For the spell said one thing that I never told Margot, that I could never go back to the way it had been or transfer again. But now that I have seen through her eyes what the hell is like, perhaps it is time that I start to explore this world and discover exactly what it means to die. And maybe along the way, I can learn to live. Richard Saxon wrote this story and many others for this channel. He is coming out with his first book April 22nd. If you want to help support him and this channel, you can pre-order his book now. It is only $2.99 or free if you have Kindle Unlimited. I don't know how you'll receive this message, but you need to wake up. Those were the words I found plastered on my television screen. I was mere moments from drifting off to sleep. My wife lay peacefully in my lap. She'd already fallen into a peaceful slumber as we watched an old gangster movie that had dragged on for a bit too long. Still, the words alone were enough to jolt me back to attention. They just lingered there on a plain black screen. After a few seconds of staring, the text changed. "Please, wake up," the screen said. It was just past midnight, which was an issue all on its own as I had work in the morning. But on the other hand, I wasn't entirely convinced I hadn't fallen asleep. It might just have been an odd dream, but then the text changed again. "Wake up, Devin Larson." That wasn't my name, nor was it the name of anyone I knew. It was just a random bunch of letters thrown at my screen, interrupting my leisure time. I looked over at the time, an old grandpa clock with hand-carved symbols I'd never been able to decipher. It read 2:54 a.m., meaning almost 3 hours had passed since the first message popped up on the television. Yet to me, only a single moment had gone by. By then, panic had started to rise within my body. I gently shook my wife, trying to wake her up. "Mary, please look at this," I almost begged. She let out a quiet groan of resistance, but didn't wake up. As I stared at her peacefully lying there, my mind started to drift back to our first date. We'd met on the pier at the beach. Her hat had blown into the water, and in a futile attempt at impressing her, I dove in after it. On my way back, I slipped on the rocks, and she laughed as I tried to get back up. She thanked me, and we had an ice cream cone together. It was a perfect day, almost unreal. Why that thought intruded my distressed mind, I didn't know. In a way, it felt as if my mind was trying to repress what I'd just seen. Then I heard the sounds of men talking, which snapped my attention back to the television, which was playing a documentary of sorts. I could just barely pay attention to what the men were talking about. 100,000 people in a world full of lies, all trying to find their way out, the voice said. Had it all just been a dream? Had my tired mind partially drifted off to sleep, causing me to hallucinate? Whatever the case, I decided it was time for bed. No sooner had the thought struck my mind before I found myself halfway up the stairs, walking towards my bedroom. I glanced down at my watch. It read 3:42 a.m. Another hour had passed in the blink of an eye. "Lars, what are you doing up?" I heard Mary say from the top of the stairs. What happened?" I asked. "I don't know. I just woke up and you weren't there. Are you okay?" she asked. "I'm not sure," I said as I shook my head to wake up. "I think The words froze in my throat because as I looked up again, my wife was gone. The hallway at the top of the stairs was empty, as if she'd never stood there. "Mary?" I called out meekly. No response. I was just left alone in the darkness, not knowing what had just happened. I could feel the adrenaline and fear rush through my veins, yet whether I was dreaming or not, I still couldn't tell. Then I heard a loud, static sound coming from the living room.
I turned around to see the television turning back on by itself. That time there wasn't any text, just a quiet, muffled voice trying to break through the mess of staticky noise.
"Devin, please, wake up,"
the voice said. I walked with trepidant steps back to the living room, trying to listen to the voice.
"The world is a lie. You have to listen. They're coming for you."
"Who are you talking about? Who are you?" I screamed at the television. Then my mind drifted back to the grandfather clock. I couldn't put my finger on exactly what was bothering me about it, but it just felt out of place, as if it didn't really exist. By then, the static had turned incomprehensible. Whatever voice was hidden within it had long since vanished. There I stood, before an innocent clock that was scaring me half to death. Thinking back, I couldn't explain where it had come from, whether it had been in the house as we moved in, or if it belonged to my wife. It had just been an ever-present object, never letting anyone pay too close attention to it. I brushed my hand against it, feeling its oddly smooth, unnatural surface. While it had looked like wood, the feel of it told an entirely different story. As I reached the face of the clock itself, I felt a shock urge through my body. Within a second, I'd been slammed towards the ground, my body freezing in place as the world vanished around me. For a moment, I fell through an infinite black void, feeling my body disintegrate with each passing second. No sooner had every atom of my being been stripped from my own flesh before I was shocked back to life. My eyes shot open, but the world ahead was nothing but a blurry mess. I was lying in some kind of fluid. I realized that much, but somehow I was still breathing. I tried to move around, but my body was too weak to form effective movement. I just kind of floated in the solution, confused and afraid. Then I noticed a tube dug into my throat. It pumped air into my lungs and sucked it back out. It was a sort of life support system, making sure I didn't suffocate or drown. I tried to scream, but how could I with a piece of plastic shoved inside me? I reached out my hand, touching a glass container that was keeping me trapped inside the fluid. A hand slammed against the glass on the other side, accompanied by a voice. "Devin!" it screamed, before the world around me faded to black once more. "Lars, wake up!" I heard Mary call out as I slowly faded back to the world I knew. She'd called my name, but it felt all too unfamiliar, almost wrong. "What happened?" I asked. "I just found you lying on the floor. Are you okay?" The images I'd seen were still stuck in my mind, as were the cryptic messages I'd heard.
"The world is a lie,"
kept repeating inside my head. I then stared up at my perfect, concerned wife. I knew that she wasn't real, nor were any of the experiences we'd had together. My false image of reality had been shattered, and I finally realized that I needed to wake up, that I had a real life to get back to. That's why I'm here now, telling this story. I figured out that among the 7 billion people on the planet, only approximately 100,000 of us are real. Those of us who are will have gotten the same message I did in one way or another, be it a text message, a song, or a YouTube video shared by a channel specializing in animation. If you are seeing this, you need to wake up. The world you live in is a lie. Please,
just wake up.
In my town, you don't look out of your window at night. Ever since I was a toddler, my parents would always tell me, "Don't look out the window at night." I always asked them why, but they shrugged it off with a smile and a simple, "because." As I got older, I stopped questioning it and did what they said. I assumed it was normal everywhere else, since every person I knew did the same. When I turned 18, I moved out of town for college. It was during Christmas break of my second year when I found out the reason behind the town's strange tradition. The first night at my parents' house, I remember them telling me not to look out the window. I gave a smile and a small chuckle before telling them I wouldn't. However, curiosity struck me the moment they left the room. At college, other people looked out their windows at night without a care in the world. I didn't know what the big deal was. As I lay in the dark, I came to a decision. I would look out the window. It wasn't that big of a deal. Just as my hand came to the sheer white curtain of the guest room, I paused. My mind flashed to that one time when I was 12. My parents were talking in the kitchen. I was home with the flu and was about to make my way to the sink for some water, but I stopped at the doorway. I hid behind the wall, peeking my head out from the doorway just an inch. My mother was crying, and my father was holding her and rocking. "That poor little girl. I feel horrible for her family," whispered my mother. My father just nodded and continued holding her. I went back to my room after that. Several hours later, my dad came up to my room with several 2x4s and boarded up my windows. "What are you doing that for, Dad?" I asked him. "Oh, it's nothing. Just safety reasons," he replied. I learned at school the next day that a little girl, a classmate's sister, was found dead the previous morning, the window broken and curtains torn. My hand drew back from the curtain. I shook my head, cursing myself for being so weird. What was the worst that could happen? It was just a window. It couldn't hurt me. As I reached my hand out again, my instinct was telling, no, shouting at me to stop. My gut twisted as I reached nearer and nearer. Just as I touched the curtain, a painful howl came from the forest surrounding the house. I flinched back, deciding just to lay down and try to get some sleep. I forgot how hard it was to get sleep in my hometown. Every night, coyotes howled for hours, everywhere in town. The next night, I woke up in a cold sweat. I glanced over at the alarm clock next to my bed. It was midnight. I groaned and sat up in bed. A low growling sounded from outside of my bedroom window. I thought back to last night and decided that I had made up my mind about looking out. I thrusted my arm towards the curtain and pulled back hard, almost ripping it away from the rod. I flattened myself against the wall next to the bed for a moment before I put one eye in front of the window. I immediately regretted my decision as I heard claws clacking up the house. I flung myself out of bed, tumbling on the floor. I stood up and got back up on the bed. I stuck my face closer to the window as the clacking got closer and closer. It suddenly stopped for a second before the most horrible creature popped up from outside, emitting a horrible shriek as it did so. I can never forget its face, the way the hollow eyes oozed some kind of black substance like tar, and the way its lips were pulled back into a gruesome grin, the teeth blood-stained and razor-sharp. It looked like it had 4 limbs, its front 2 slamming on the glass and pounding. As I was frozen in front of the window in terror, my parents burst into the room. My father held a shotgun. He marched up to my bed and yanked me away from the window. He pointed his shotgun at the creature, shooting a bullet at it. The thing scrambled away, leaving the window almost completely shattered. "Damn it, son, it was a simple task. Just don't look out the window. How hard is that?" my dad shouted at me. I wasn't processing his words. I was sitting on the floor, arms and legs splayed everywhere in utter shock. What the hell had I just seen? My mother ran to the bedroom door. She had tears in her eyes. "Is everyone all right?" she asked. "Yeah, we're fine. We still gotta get that creepy fucking monster, though. Nathan, get up. We got some work to do," my dad said. I got up as soon as I could. My dad thrust the shotgun into my arms and marched downstairs. He opened the basement door and descended, coming back with a machete and some kind of spray bottle. He sprayed the liquid onto the machete before walking to the front door and wait. "Dad, what are you doing?" I asked, confused. I was just traumatized, and now my dad is waiting at the door, machete in hand like he was about to kill someone. Instead of a response, my dad just hushed me. The house was quiet for several seconds before a loud banging and howling came at the front door. We heard a rip, and we knew the screen door was no more. The wood of the interior door started to splinter, and I took a few steps backward. My dad glared at me. "Nathan, now is not the time for this. Point the goddamn gun and get ready to shoot." I aimed the gun at the door, trying to find the spot where the howling was coming from. The door was strong, but it wasn't indestructible. The creature burst through the door, and I pulled the trigger in a moment of terrified panic. My dad knelt down and brought his machete down on the abomination's head. The howling ceased, and my mom rushed forward with a tarp to cover the spot where the door was destroyed. "Honey, are you okay?" my mom asked for the second time that night. She came up to me and kissed my cheeks, as if to make sure I was still there. She went over to my dad and did the same. "We're okay, Martha, both of you. Get in the basement. I gotta clean this up." "Basement? Why the basement?" I asked. Everything was going by at the speed of light, and I couldn't help but question everything that was happening in the moment. "Let's just get in the basement. Your father needs to clean up," my mom said, grabbing my arm and pulling me to the basement. We sat on the couch down there for what seemed like hours before my dad came in and put the machete up. He sat on the chair in front of us with an exhausted sigh. The 3 of us sat in silence for a few minutes. In that time span, my brain was able to come up with a coherent sentence. "Dad, what was that thing?" He just looked up at me, eyes dark, and said, "Where do you think that howling came from?" Thanks for watching, and don't forget to check out the Dr. No Sleep podcast available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. There you will find a plethora of bone-chilling horror stories to listen to. Also, be sure to subscribe and turn notifications on to stay tuned for new videos.